So thank you so much for joining us today, guys. We're gonna be starting in around a minute or two, just giving everyone else some time to join. Okay, awesome. I think everyone's in. We're gonna go ahead and get started now. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am really glad that you're here. I am Laura Cohen, Sales Director at Complif. And today we're going to be talking about something that sits at the heart of every broker dealer's compliance program, and that is KYC and client onboarding. And what we want to leave you with today is a clearer picture of where the bar is being set right now and what it actually takes to meet it. Joining us is Dominic Morosini. Dominic Morosini is a senior manager at Kaufman Rawson's broker dealer and investment advisor practice within the Risk Advisory Services Group. He brings over 20 years of regulatory experience. He advises clients on strengthening the risk management frameworks, supervisory controls, and anti-money laundering compliance programs, helping organizations proactively identify vulnerabilities, mitigate risk, and align their operations with evolving regulatory requirements. Before joining Kaufman Rawson, Dominic spent nearly 2 decades at Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, so better known as FINRA, where he held roles in financial reporting, firm examinations, and risk monitoring. He conducted complex examinations and risk assessments of broker-dealers with a focus on sales practices, AML, regulatory capital, and regulation best interests. His deep knowledge of securities regulation, accounting, and risk analysis allows him to provide strategic guidance and very well-rounded insights on both financial and operation risk exposures. Thank you so much, Dominic, for joining us today. I really appreciate your expertise. Guys, we have an expert today, and we believe that we're going to be able to bring you a lot of insights and things you can take with to your institutions, to your team.
Great. I appreciate the introduction, Laura. The area of AML is a continued focus for FINRA and firms, right? And you've seen it within the last year. Specifically, FINRA increased its AML enforcement activity by over 50% in 2025. And that led to an increase of fines in the AML space from 2.5 million to over 10 million. And some of the areas that were highlighted in those AML cases were linked to poor customer due diligence. And that starts right at the onboarding, at the ongoing stages. And you see firms had failures in areas to properly risk assess customers, right? And to properly categorize them as high risk and doing the certain things that will need to be done, once you do label that customer as a high risk customer. So a lot of failures in that area. It's obviously an area FINRA continues to focus on. So this is a great topic for us to discuss, which is pertinent to broker dealers.
Yeah, awesome. So let's go over through a quick overview of what we're going to cover. And then throughout the process, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A. We'll address them towards the end. So getting back on the agenda, some of the key things that we're going to cover today are, first, we're going to go looking at the new front line. Secondly, the regulatory landscape, what's changing, where firms are falling short, looking at the shift, right, from static KYC to dynamic customer understanding, building an effective onboarding framework, what examiners expect to see, and then we'll just, round it up and cover some key takeaways. So to begin, KYC, as we know, it's no longer just account opening. It is the control point that determines whether the rest of your AML program is going to succeed or fail. So given said that, to get us grounded and get us started and why that matters so much right now, I'm going to hand it over to Dominic, who's going to walk us through what FINRA has been focused on and what that means for how we think about the onboarding process.
Yeah, so to kind of simplify things, right? There's four main parts to a firm's AML program. It's your KYC, it's your customer due diligence, it's your surveillance, and it's going to be your ongoing monitoring. And so, a simple analogy I like to think about, and you can think of your AML program like building a house, right? And the foundation is where you start to build that house. And KYC is that foundation. So KYC is going to be the process where you're verifying a customer's identity, you're establishing that they are who they claim to be before the account is opened, right? And then the KYC data that you collect at that point in time then is going to impact all your downstream controls. So if you have KYC data that's incomplete or inaccurate, it will affect customer risk ratings, alert thresholds, your investigations, and potentially your SAR decisions, right? So I think when you have a poor foundation, going back to the analogy of building a house, it's going to put everything built on top of it at risk. And the next area is customer due diligence. And I like to think of this as the framing of the house. Okay. It's going to give structure to the customer profile. You're going to establish your expected trading behavior, your funding patterns, your account usage, right? Really understanding how that account is going to be used. So where KYC tells you who the customer is, customer due diligence is going to explain how that customer will be used. So it's within this part of your program where you're going to establish the initial risk rating. You're going to establish and set a baseline for how the account will be monitored. And I see strong firms that have strong AML programs, right? They have strong framing in this area because it's going to support everything that follows. So you'll have more effective surveillance. Your investigations will be more efficient, and risk decisions will be more consistent as well. So, as you know, going back to the house analogy, right, is if you think of customer due diligence as the framing, right, can the home withstand real pressure that you've built with the foundation and the framing? So next area I'll talk about is surveillance systems. And I like to think of your surveillance system as your electrical and the plumbing of the house, right? They keep things running day to day, monitoring the flow of funds, detecting when something is not working as expected. So, where you'll see surveillance systems being built, it's only going to be as good as the data points that you've built into the surveillance system, right? It's only as good as the customer data, the risk ratings, and the expected activity the system was built on. So, if you have poor inputs in this area, you're going to see poor outputs. So, what does that mean? That means alerts not working properly. That means excessive false positives. And that could lead to ineffective investigations. And so, one area you'll see is an exhaustive amount of alerts. I see this with a lot of firms. They have some surveillance system they've established, but now they have an exhaustive amount of these alerts, and it's led to alert fatigue, as I like to call it. And when everything is becoming an alert, the compliance has they'll get into the frame of mind where they're just closing all of the alerts. Now it's not really a true investigation because so many false positives are happening. And what that does is it increases the risk of really missing real issues that are happening at the firm. So we really want to create a strong design of your surveillance system to create more efficient monitoring. When your surveillance system is aligned with customer profiles, you're going to see better quality alerts. You're going to see faster investigations, and you're going to see more consistent outcomes. If the foundation and framing are weak, your surveillance system isn't going to fix it. It's only going to amplify those problems. So if you think about the next area, ongoing monitoring, I like to think of this as your maintenance and inspection process, right? So risk nowadays does not stand still. Ongoing monitoring must continuously reassess whether the original customer profile holds true. Does the real activity match what you expected at customer onboarding, right? If trading patterns, funding sources, and account activity do not match what was expected at the customer onboarding, right? Firms need to conduct a reassessment of that customer risk, right? And not only that, customer firms need to be able to demonstrate how the monitoring leads to updated risk ratings, leads to escalations, leads to potential enhanced due diligence, right? So the goal of your ongoing monitoring is not only to catch suspicious activity, but to continuously refine how the firm understands that customer, okay? And in the broker-dealer space, the strongest firms and strongest AML programs I see are ones that evolve through the ongoing monitoring. And weaker ones are going to be reactionary, whether that's through FINRA examinations and findings, right? You'll see effective programs proactively adjust their frameworks while the weaker programs will only respond. So I'll kind of close it out with this ongoing monitoring is not going to fix the weak foundation. It's only going to expose it.
Yeah, and I really like that analogy. I feel like it really sets the stage well, especially for our next topic, right? Giving a regulatory landscape and what's changing. So it gets to something very important, right? The reason this foundation matters more than ever is because the regulatory environment is actively shifting underneath us. And technology has fundamentally changed what's possible within KYC and onboarding. But with that comes very clear signals from regulators. If you have the tools to do this better, they're definitely expecting for you to use them and to use them very thoughtfully, right? So given that we're mentioning the technology is fundamentally changing, the regulatory landscape, there's being, just raising the expectations of how firms collect, verify, and use customer information to understand risk and support ongoing compliance decisions. So, Dominic, I'd love for you to take us deeper on this. Specifically, what regulators are now expecting from firms when it comes to KYC and onboarding in this technology-driven environment.
Yeah, so I totally agree. Technology is significantly reshaping KYC and the onboarding landscape. It's changed, how firms collect the information and also what regulators expect to see. So, firms that have the strongest AML programs are no longer operating in a manual or static environment, right? They're constantly reassessing and they're using technology to do that. And some of the technology I've seen out there with some of the stronger programs are ones that are using the digital onboarding tools, right? Programs that are using automated identity verification, right? And so they're using data-driven risk scoring to build their customer profiles more quickly and at scale through technology. So I'm seeing, in this space, the technology is being used in these tools to strengthen KYC accuracy and consistency. But with that being said, firms must still ensure that the AML systems themselves are integrated to connect the onboarding data with the AML and the fraud monitoring, right? So there's technology risks. And I'll speak to, what regulators expect to see, right? The regulator is going to come in and make sure that you can understand how the tools and the systems make decisions, not just rely on the outputs. You'll have to be able to explain that, right? So poorly created systems can potentially create blind spots rather than actually reduce the risk. So regulators are going to expect these tools to enhance the accuracy and the consistency, but they do not still replace, judgment and oversight. So while technology has enabled firms to use onboarding data more continuously to support risk assessments, support their surveillance systems, and customer monitoring throughout the account, there's also the risk of, hey, can you really explain how that system and how your technology is working and working together? So while technology's raised the bar for what firms can do, right, it's also raised the expectations for what regulators expect to see. So if you have, tools, you must be able to show that you understand them, that you're governing them, and that you're using them to drive real risk insight.
Awesome. And, I agree. And one of the things that often comes up for us on the technology space is when you mention about the systems, right? A lot of the times the systems are not speaking to each other. And I think that, we need to do better at enhancing that communications between the systems on itself.
Absolutely.
So moving on to where firms are falling short and just piggybacking on what you're saying in terms of the expectations, right? So we're seeing higher expectations, obviously better tools, but that comes with more scrutiny, right? And yet, despite real investments in the space and the availability of new technology, many firms are still finding themselves on the wrong side of an exam finding. Which tells us that the issue isn't usually about effort or resources. It's about whether the KYC process is actually producing accurate, consistent, and usable information that is going to drive decisions downstream. Despite the significant investment, like I said, in onboarding tools, AML systems, many firms are still falling short because their KYC processes are not producing the accurate, consistent, and usable customer risk profiles that effectively drive monitoring and decision making. So, Dominic, can you walk us through where you're seeing firms get this wrong, even when they've made real investments, using technology?
Yeah, for sure. So, first here I'll talk about is just incomplete and superficial data. And what do I mean by that? That kind of means like, well, obviously incomplete, right? It's not complete, but superficial data, I call it the check the box, right? And it's information that looks complete, but it doesn't meaningfully help you understand who the customer is or how the account is going to be used, right? And the issues I see in this area is over reliance on customer provided information. There's no validation of that information. You're over reliance on the customer for what they provide. And that's going to lead to inaccurate customer profiles and weak downstream monitoring. So when you have the incomplete or the superficial data, it kind of sets yourself up for failure. Next area is the weak risk profiling. We're seeing firms fall short here. And so what I mean here is we're seeing customer risk ratings not accurately reflecting the true risk of customers, and they're not meaningful enough to drive the monitoring and the controls. So what we're seeing here is you have this customer risk profile that you set up, but it's not being effectively tied to the products. It's not being tied to the expected activity, and it's not being tied to the customer behavior. So as you're seeing those areas evolve, and they're trading in certain products or the expected activity is changing, you have a weak risk profile. And so you're not having, data-driven events. And so you need to be understanding those products that customers are trading in. Does the expected activity align with what kind of activity we're seeing in the P&S blotters? And so when you do see changes there, you'll need to update that risk profile of that customer and not just be static, letting it, sit from what you took on and you rated it at the onboarding point. And so next area I'll talk about is fragmented onboarding process. And this is a real problem we see when you have disconnected systems. You're having manual handoffs between the areas, right? And what I mean by that is like customer data being collected in one platform. You'll have identity verification performed in another platform, and then the risk rating might be assigned in a third system, right? With manual inputs between each step. So the results of that could be inconsistency in how the customer profiles are built, right? What you don't want to see is two customers with similar attributes have different onboarding outcomes, right? We want to see consistency in that area. If they have the similar attributes and the similar profiles, it should produce the same outcome if you have a good process in place. And then from a regulatory perspective, it becomes difficult to show how the decisions are based on a standardized framework if you're having different outcomes of your systems when you're onboarding and not really understanding who the customer is, and it doesn't have the correct controlled repeatable process. And so, what I see in the space is where you'll see sales teams collect information. We'll see operations process the accounts, and then compliance reviews the exceptions. And we have AML teams assessing flow of funds, but it's not really governed by one singular supervisory control person, right? And so you're having the fragmented teams putting together different collecting different areas and putting inputs into your systems. And so then that can lead to, failure to connect the KYC to the AML surveillance. So you're having customer data that's then collected and not used, right? So you have surveillance operating independently. Alerts are lacking context, right? You're having higher false positive of alerts, which lead to missed risks. So I think firms need to kind of get out of the thinking of KYC as a one-time event. And one area and a story I'd like to share is kind of through my time as working as a regulator at FINRA. And I think it's a good example of fragmented onboarding and having your systems disconnected. And a firm that I saw where FINRA brought a case was where they had effective onboarding and they identified this customer as a PEP at the onboarding process. They identified him as high risk. And the firm then, what happened was after the account was there for 2 years, their ongoing monitoring picked up that this customer was arrested for corruption in his home country. And at that point in time, the firm closed the account, due to the fact that he was arrested for corruption. But then when FINRA came back and took a holistic look at the account from the time it was onboarded to the time it was closed, there were tons of red alerts that were not picked up by the firm's surveillance system for the 2 years that the account was active at the firm. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they saw the money coming in, and the trade blotter was not being properly assessed for red flags. And what the customer was doing was he was layering the money in. And so he was buying fixed income products that had a long-term hold investment objective. And what we were seeing was he was taking these products that are typically a long-term investment horizon, and he was churning them and selling them within 30 days of buying some of these fixed income products. And the firm's trading desk never asked him why he was doing this, right? It doesn't really make sense to buy certain bonds and then turn them and sell them 2, 3 weeks later. So FINRA ended up, making a case because they said if you had an effective surveillance system in place, you would have flagged this stuff prior to him being arrested for corruption. They would have raised the red flags. And so I think it's a good example of having, a fragmented fragmented onboarding and fragmented systems and controls, where the trading system, the onboarding, and the ongoing monitoring aren't working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess for me, listening to the case, there's a few red flags, one of them being, lack of process automation, right? How can we automate these processes? So like you said, why are we getting different results for the same type of, customer? And also the data, we need to be able to make use of the data. I can't just die at onboarding, so and that really really sets us up good for our next topic, which is the shift, right? Let's focus on the shift. How do we go from static KYC to dynamic customer understanding? So what we're hearing in all of those gaps, right, everything that we've been mentioning, it's really one underlying theme, I will say. And Dominic, tell me if I'm wrong, but firms are still treating KYC as a moment in time rather than an ongoing process. And that has to change. The world your customers operate in is constantly evolving, and your understanding of them needs to evolve with it. We need to take KYC from a point in time collection to continuous risk assessment. And, I would love to hear your perspective, Dominic, on what this shift actually looks like in practice. How should firms be rethinking KYC so that it becomes something more continuous and dynamic?
Yeah. So, the way you would see it, previously is you see a lot of manual paperwork, right? Gathering of information of the customer during KYC, and then the firms would scan it and keep it in their files, but they never look at it again, right? And firms really should try to shift away from that thinking on KYC, right? Moving away from the idea that onboarding is a single event, right? You're collecting the information, you're assigning the risk rating, and then you just move on. Okay. The firms with the strongest AML programs are continuously assessing for changes, right? Changes in customer behavior, changes in the data, changes in the risk exposure, right? As increased trading volume happens, or if the customer who is, establishing himself as a blue chip stock trader is now trading in micro cap securities, that's something that should be considered to potentially update the risk assessment of that customer. So, when you're seeing those things happen, those static profiles become outdated when there's a material change, right? If a customer is telling he's going to trade blue chip equities and he's now trading OTC microcap stocks, right? That's a shift, and firms should know that and consider those things within their customer risk assessments, right? And I think regulators and examiners are increasingly looking for whether firms are maintaining that dynamic understanding of their customers over time, right? So they're looking for whether onboarding information is not just stored, but actively used and refreshed through ongoing monitoring, material events, and updating the risk assessments. So, really to kind of close this out, I'll say that KYC is becoming a continuous process that is directly connected to the surveillance systems, to the alerts, to the escalations, rather than something that ends once the account is opened.
Yeah, and I think we can both agree as well. Once we get to, those periodic reviews, it makes it a whole lot easier as well to have a very good and stable onboarding process. So on to the next. How do we build an effective onboarding framework, right? So once a firm commits, we're committed to that shift. We went from static to dynamic. The natural question becomes, what does a well-built framework actually look like? Because one thing to say KYC should be continuous and risk-based, and it's another to implement that across your onboarding workflows, your data systems, and your compliance teams. An effective onboarding framework is one that is risk-based. It is consistently applied and fully integrated into surveillance and monitoring so that the customer information actively drives compliance decisions throughout the whole life cycle of this account. So let's get concrete here. When you're working with firms on this, Dominic, what are the core components that they are actually need to get right for the framework to work in practice?
Yeah, so there's really five core components, and we have them listed out there in the slide, but I'll go through kind of each one and just kind of give some, some background and some details on those, effective frameworks. And so the first is strong customer identification and verification foundation, right? The firms really need to be confident about who that person is, right? Who that customer is. And so they want to have you need to have a well-established customer identification program. You will need to have appropriate verification steps, making sure those steps are then consistently applied. And if there are exceptions or red flags, making sure things are properly escalated when those exceptions do arise, right? So really, that's kind of the foundation, really having those controls in place where you can verify and say, I know who this customer is, right? And then once that's established, you really need to have meaningful customer due diligence, right? And that speaks to understanding the purpose of the account, right? The nature of the relationship that you're going to have with this customer, right? Understanding the type of activity that should be expected in the account, right? This kind of context gives the customer profile real value, right? And you'll be able to then use that information to feed into your surveillance systems and really understand if that purpose of the account that they represented during your due diligence portion is really holding true. And so, the next area I'll talk about is risk-based segmentation models, right? And this is where you're assigning your customers into risk tiers, right, based upon the information that you collected during the customer due diligence, right? And those factors are going to be the products that they use, right? The trading profile, right? The customer profile characteristics, right? Whether they're based in a certain geographic location, right? Where is the source of their wealth? Are they a government official? Do you properly identify them as a PEP? Right? Those are all factors that need to be built into your risk based tiers of that you'll be setting for the customers themselves, right? And then as you establish those tiers, that should drive the level of onboarding scrutiny and ongoing review that you're going to have on the account, right? So when you're establishing that this is going to be a high risk account, you should have a higher level of scrutiny. You should also have a higher level of ongoing reviews of those accounts because you know that they are established as high risk based upon certain characteristics that was established during the onboarding. And then the next area I'll talk about is integrating your AML surveillance with the monitoring, right? So this is making sure the information you collected at our onboarding doesn't sit in isolation, right? The information needs to feed downstream to your systems, right? We need to make sure that the alerts, the thresholds, the investigative priorities are based on what the firm already knows about that customer. So everything you kind of see the theme here is they're built on one another, right? So as you're building out your effective framework, you can't leave or have an ineffective area because the next area is going to be built in off that information and data that you collected in the previous area. And then last area I'll talk about is governance and quality assurance, right? There needs to be periodic supervisory oversight of the onboarding decisions, okay? Also, periodic testing of how the framework is operating in practice. Are your alerts generating properly? Are your investigations then being done properly? Are escalations then being escalated properly? All those things need to take, firms need to take a holistic look at all those to really say, yes, our system in place is being implemented correctly, right? And so you need to have a clear accountability, right? Ensuring that that process is consistently applied across the firm. And just to kind of close out this section. KYC really is the starting point, right? And then you'll have their customer due diligence, really building the understanding of the customer, right? And setting up their risk assessment during this stage of the process. And then finally, onboarding is really bringing that process together, right? And marrying the KYC and the customer due diligence.
Yeah, I mean, to a T. That was great. So we have discussed, right? So moving on, everything we've discussed, let's say the framework, the integration, the dynamic approach, ultimately has to hold up to this regulatory scrutiny. That means that you need to be able to demonstrate it, not just describe it. Regulators aren't just looking for a well-written policy, they're looking for evidence that your program is operating the way that you're saying that it is. They're looking for it to be consistent with a clear connection between your customer data as well as monitoring this activity. So let's talk about the exam experience, Dominic. When regulators are actually reviewing a firm's onboarding and KYC program, what are the specific things they're looking for to determine whether it's actually working as intended?
Yeah, great question. So, from my time and experience as an examiner with the regulators, I see that one area they look at is ensuring that you have an evidence of your risk-based approach, right? And that means that firm has identified relevant risk factors, they've applied them in a structured way, and they use them to differentiate how customers are onboarded and monitored, right? So you have to have an ability to explain that to regulators, right? Why is a customer rated a certain way? What risks do they present, right? And how that risk rating informs your downstream monitoring. You'll have to be able to demonstrate all those to regulators to demonstrate you have an effective implementation of your AML program. And other areas you want to see is consistency across accounts. Similar accounts with the same attributes should be treated in a similar way. You don't want to have situations where, depending upon who in your compliance department is handling the onboarding, having a different outcome depending on who's opening that account. You want to see consistency applied, whether it's Mary's opening that account or Joe's opening that account. You want to be able to prove and evidence to regulators that we're doing things consistently, and accounts with similar attributes produce the same risk rating. And you'll want to do that by also linking, examiners want to see linkage between the KYC data and the AML monitoring itself. So, that's basically making sure that the information collected at onboarding doesn't sit in isolation, right? It's directly informing your surveillance scenarios. It's informing your alert prioritization, and it's also informing your ongoing customer risk management. We want to make sure that the firm is operating in an integrated control environment rather than a set of disconnected functions. So I think really hammering home the right consistency and being able to demonstrate to the regulators that we have a consistent approach, it's risk-based and repeatable, which is a key area that examiners and FINRA will be looking for.
Yeah, I think the conversation today has been amazing. I think we're running a little bit of time, so I know we received a couple of questions. We'll get back to you individually after the webinar, but leaving you with just a few key takeaways, right? What are 4 things that you can walk away with? 1, onboarding drives ML effectiveness. If the foundation is weak, everything downstream is at risk. Static KYC models are no longer sufficient. Regulators expect a dynamic, continuous approach. Integration across functions is critical. Your onboarding data needs to actively feed your monitoring systems. Going back to that, your systems need to be able to connect with each other and be able to share information and talk with each other. Simplicity and clarity outperform complexity. A consistent and well-governed framework will always outperform a complicated one that isn't being applied. Obviously, if any of this sparked questions about your own program in your institutions, we definitely encourage you to use it as a starting point for our conversations with your compliance, your AML teams, your operations teams. And we're happy to continue this conversation. So please feel free to reach out to either Dom or myself. And then now we just want to cover just some things. We are going to have our own product demo from Complif. So I would love to have you guys join us. You can go ahead and scan the QR code and sign up. It's going to be Tuesday, May 19th. And then we can actually be able to see an actual walkthrough of how broker-dealers are modernizing their KYC on onboarding. Also, if you want the slides for this presentation, feel free to reach out to us as well. We'll gladly share it. And ultimately, if we can go on, we'd like to let you know we're going to be at the next FINRA event. It's going to be taking place in Washington, D.C. It's going to be May 12th to the 14th, and both myself and Dominic will be there. So if you're attending, send us a message. We'd love to connect. We'd love to have conversations or even just to hear feedback from what we provided today. Given said, thank you so much, Dominic, for allowing us this space and this time and sharing with us all of your great insights. Thank you for everyone that joined us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.